Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jonathan, and I'm really excited to be here as your host today, representing Regrow on this webinar, where plans meet people. Just going to let folks file in a little bit and talk about kind of the genesis of this event. The teams on the Regrow side and the Farm Journal side were talking about kind of their unique data sets and experience that they bring to companies up and down the ag supply chain, and thinking about like if we were to bring these two data sets together, would 1 plus 1 equal 3? Would these two circles like overlap and create something that's more powerful for people up and down the supply chain, like I said, from CPGs all the way down to program implementators, giving them, kind of supercharged data and insights to run more effective programs. So basically, Regrow will bring the sustainability and agronomic insights, and then the Farm Journal team bringing more behavioral insights about folks on the ground. So really excited to get into that today. I hope that y'all are kind of excited by this concept. And yeah, with that, let's get into it. First, though, I do want to wish everyone a happy Earth Day. I just realized that this morning. So hopefully, after this hour sitting in front of your computer, you can go spend a little bit of time outside. So awesome. So yeah, speakers today, again, I'm Jonathan Unger. I'm the Director of Marketing and GTM Strategy here at Regrow. Really lucky to be able to work with a team of scientists and policy experts and sustainability pros to help companies make their ag supply chains more resilient. So joined today by Candace Burgish, who's representing Farm Journal. So Candace, I'll toss over to you.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, nice to be here, and thanks for the invitation, Jonathan. I'm the Director of Data Insights and also Storytelling at Farm Journal and Trust in Food. Really focused on translating that data into actionable programs. What do you need to know? What do you have as opportunities in front of you? And where are there kind of trends and barriers of opportunity across the different data and ways that we can look at it? So I'll be kind of speaking into that lens today, both through Farm Journal and our initiative, Trust in Food. So thanks for the invitation. Excited to talk today.
Awesome. Thanks, Candace. Also did want to do some housekeeping at the top of the call. So just so you know, the webinar is being recorded, and we'll share the recording afterwards in the next 24 hours or so with anyone who registered. So no worries if you have to jump at any point. If you want to leave any questions behind, you can do that and we'll get back to you. Please do use the question and answer widget in Zoom to submit questions. We'll leave some time at the end to answer any that you have. We're going to go probably about 30 to 45 minutes of content and make sure to save some time at the end. And I'll also mention this at the end, but when you do leave the webinar, please fill out the survey. It's super helpful for us to know what your feedback is and how we can improve moving forward. So with all that being said, let's get into it. I do like to start off any, event like this with a little bit of intention setting, so just everyone being on the same page. So today's event will be successful if you can understand how sustainability data and behavioral data work together to make program design more effective. And also if you feel something, you feel more confident that the tooling and the expertise exists where you can close the gap between basically what your best laid plans are and actually getting farmers to participate in these kind of programs. And then also we want to really like empower people to be able to take action. So can you actually apply these learnings to either existing or new program design? Consider what opportunities exist to improve. So I really want folks to leave with a greater understanding and confidence to be able to go out and do something in the world. So here's the flow for today. First, we'll just do some quick intros, particularly for folks who might not be familiar with Regrow or Farm Journal Trust and Food. Why are we partnering? We talked a little bit about this already, but then the way that we frame this is through basically a case study. So this will be a mock case study where we do an opportunity analysis. So we'll look through like where are there areas for impact in my supply chain? What does the sustainability data essentially tell us? And then we'll move from doing that footprinting, hotspotting, and trying to understand like what's happening on the ground to actually designing a program to affect that. So what are the considerations for a successful program? How does that apply in this mock case study that we've set up? And again, we'll leave some time for Q&A, what resonated with folks, and yeah, outstanding questions. So real quick to introduce for people who don't know Regrow, I think our impact stats, which I show here, really illustrative of what we do and what the technology is about. So at our core, to simplify it, we're a combination of two proprietary pieces of technology. One is remote sensing, so using satellite imagery to and models that we have to determine what actually is happening on a field and what has happened over the history of that field. So, what crop was grown, what practices were adopted, what sort of rotations exist, what are the field boundaries, basically giving companies the ability to understand what's happening on ground without actually going and doing that data collection. So to that point, we have 1.7 billion acres continuously monitored. And then going from kind of this understanding and planning into action. And that's like really the heart of it, which is 7.4 acres, million acres contracted for regen ag projects that happen on our MRV platform, which is kind of like the program management platform. 1.4 million projected tons of CO2e abated, and 52 million plus in farmer payments that have been facilitated through programs that Regrow helps run. So can see kind of like who we've worked with in the past. And then we really think about it on this ag resilience journey, sort of like flywheel. So, first of all, baselining and reporting your progress, then prioritizing and planning ROI positive investments, and then actually activating programs. And today we'll really focus more on kind of the first two steps. There's a whole nother set of considerations once you get into a program actually being running, and sort of what tech needs there are, all sorts of different considerations, but we'll focus more in that program planning today. If folks enjoy this, we can do kind of a follow-up that talks more about the execution aspect. Great. So let me hand over to Candace.
Thanks, Jonathan. At Farm Journal Intelligence. If you don't know us, and you might be familiar with Farm Journal or not, so I'll kind of set the groundwork and give you some context for where all the data that we're going to talk about is coming from. Essentially, Farm Journal is one of the oldest agriculture publications out there, originally starting with the service of one farmer putting on a piece of paper the best time to plant in Pennsylvania and passing it to another. And it's been Farm Journal like that ever since. So it's really based around service journalism as that farm journal ecosystem. But over time, as you can imagine, over 150 years, we've amassed to be a little bit larger of a group, a lot more sophisticated areas, and some specialized disciplines. So one of those is Farm Journal Intelligence, which is the team that I'm a part of, which basically we're looking at how do we use data to both make ourselves better as Farm Journal as a service to producers and also support our partners along the way through shared goals of supporting and providing information and resources to these producers. So we do that in a few different ways, both by looking directly at our primary data first party, looking at something called behavioral data, human dimensions of change principle. If you're familiar, is something that underpins our specific approach to navigating people-centered data and how they interact with different pieces and really getting into the what, the where, the why behind different actions and behaviors. And then also kind of our end goal, our remit as farm journal intelligence is to predict, be able to anticipate what the results might be, change strategies, and really just be more effective and efficient by design from the beginning. So that's really the overall intelligence perspective. So if you go to the next slide, Jonathan. Where's that data coming from, right? Where's the fuel? So I mentioned Farm Journal up there and kind of in the upper left-hand corner of our omnichannel brands area, you can see our original publication, which is still in print, which is incredible. But also we have amassed a lot of different brands and areas of opportunity as well. So there's a myriad of different brands that are under this Farm Journal ecosystem, from events to auction websites to specific disciplinary kind of areas and publications to all of our broadcast channels. So we're on TV, we're on streaming TV now, podcasts, radio, everything in between. So as farmers and producers interact with those different pieces of content, we are collecting data to make our product better. And that's going to be some of the data points that we're talking about through real producer behavior. And then also on the left-hand side, you'll see we source our data from third parties as well. So cleaned, verified, turned from cumbersome into useful kind of data sets that exist from USDA, FSA, all of those kind of data sets you might be familiar with, as well as really specialized ones. We've taken into a big mass of soil data recently to really dig deeper into some of those practices conversations. As needs come up, we investigate those as well. And then really pair it all together with our first party data, which is really crucial, talking to producer at scale, self-reported information. Are you interested in technology? Are you in taking on a practice? What do you need? What are your wishes, opinions, dreams? We have those conversations at scale, and those become data points. So it's really about these three connecting points that kind of underpin our work. So if you go to the next slide, all of this kind of comes together through one initiative I'm going to highlight today, which is specifically around sustainability, which is what we have all in common today on this webinar, which is focusing on conservation practice uptake, sustainable farming methods, and really driving change forward. So Farm Journal has invested in this specifically to support kind of the industry overall. And we call that organization Trust in Food as our initiative. So we're really kind of talking into both of these organizations and well integrated as well. So if you go to the next slide, what that looks like on the ground, I'm really quite practical as a person. So I like to make sure it's laid out of what does that mean. All these different ecosystems and org charts mean great, but what do we do? So basically what we do at Farm Journal Intelligence and Trust in Food is use this data to find ideal producers that are win-win opportunities matched well with each other on different kind of opportunities and kind of needs and solution bases. And then using that to understand and plan your territories. So there's a lot of great information. This is really where Jonathan was talking about our synergy kind of coming together, was in this planning and understanding area, both on the ground and at the producer level, but also understanding these producers and then turning that data into useful intelligence and influence actions. So how do we go out into market with real opportunities, invitations, and programs? So this is kind of how we'll be stepping through today. So I'll pass it back to Jonathan to show you what we came up with.
Awesome. Thanks, Candace. Yeah, and you can really see how like we're going from kind of satellite observation at scale to down to like really specific program planning on the ground and how those, hopefully you see how those insights come together. Cool. So, like I said, we wanted to anchor everything that we're going to talk about today in a specific scenario. Hopefully, that'll land a little bit better than talking about like a typical program in the abstract. I do want to caveat that there are some variables in this that are a bit simplified. So, first of all, we'll be looking at one crop, which is spring wheat, meaning we aren't looking at a full rotation, which is something that's possible for regrow and also something that more and more corporates are getting interested in for multi-stakeholder programs and making sure you can claim every kind of investment that you make. And then we'll be looking at county level data instead of getting more granular to the field level, which is also possible. Doing that because there's a mix of folks in the room and I don't want to get too bogged down in the details. Hopefully this will show you what's possible and then you can apply the specifics to your own supply chain and what your goals are. So just try to, keep your own goals in mind as we walk through this. So with that out of the way, let's put our imagination hats on for this one, and we'll look at this case of Bradley Bakers Co. So we're saying that Bradley is a global baked goods company. They're family owned, which means that they have a longer time horizon and a real genuine stake in making sure that their supply chain holds up over decades. And we see three like business imperatives, three reasons why they're really caring about this work and trying to learn more about regenerative agriculture, what's possible, and launch more effective programs. So these are in no particular order, but all connected. First is an SBTI flag commitment. So they set a reduction target in 2023 of 50% in net emissions. So need to do that by 2030. We're saying they've made major progress in scope one and two, which are things that are more under their control. But scope three has proven to be more challenging, and it's over 80% of their footprint. So that's where they've been struggling. They don't really have close relationships to the farm. They have partnerships with large aggregators, but there's some level of abstraction between their day-to-day and on-the-ground realities. So again, progress has been slow on that flag commitment. Second reason is supply resilience. So we'll take a look at a drought in 2024 that made their exposure to climate volatility really concrete in this crop and this geo. Um, most material crop being spring wheat from thousands of farms across the northern plains, and having a dry year, significantly cutting yields. So you really feel that when that happens. So there's an acute pain around supply resilience. And then the third is farmer outcomes. So Bradley doesn't own these farms, but and they can't necessarily mandate anything. They have to make sure that any program that they design really works for farmers economically. Otherwise, it's going to have a major enrollment and retention problem. So that's another reality that they need to design around. So we'll keep those three things in mind, emissions, resilience, and farmer economics as like the goals that we'll look at as we walk through some of the data that both Regrow and Trust in Food can bring. So what I'm going to do now is just move over to Regrow Sustainability Insights. We'll just dive into the tool for a second so you can visualize what's possible here. And the first thing that we're going to do is really map and understand their wheat sourcing region. So first thing any program really needs to have is like a geospatial representation of the supply chain so that they know, where they need to be pulling data from, essentially. So where are the farms? Where are the aggregated farms? Where did this wheat actually come from? Sounds kind of simple, but it's often the first place that things go wrong. And often it's kind of a messy answer. But the way that we have sustainability insights set up is basically that you can configure your supply shed to whatever level of traceability you have as a business. So there are different options that are really flexible. For this case, we've just set up county level, distinctions in Minnesota, South Dakota, and North Dakota. But you could also draw a circle around a supply shed or around like a mill, for example. So just as an example, real quick, you can draw a circle. You can select country, county, state, different watershed levels. I think also most importantly, you can upload unstructured procurement data. So you can basically work out of your ERP system, get that data, and Regrow can map it to the like geospatial reality. So a lot of flexibility with this in setting up the supply shed. Again, I've simplified it just down to the county level in this case, but for, to have a really, really impactful program, you want to map it even more closely. So then I'm going to just move over quickly to what we call explore. So imagine you've set the supply shed up, you've done it at county level, and now you want to see what the underlying sustainability data is that is produced there. So this is like a really easy visual way of ingesting this data. It can also be exported and transformed in different ways, but the sort of data layers that are available to you are broken out into different categories. So, first of all, your emissions data, and this ties directly back to Bradley's, SBTI flag goal. So you can look at it across net emissions factor, you can look at it from your emissions factor, and then also your sequestration, so carbon removals. I'm going to show those different layers, sort of build the story here of what we're seeing in the supply shed. Similarly, you can look at climate risk KPIs across a number of different variables. And then crucially, you can look at regenerative practice adoption. So where is there conservation tillage? Where is there cover cropping? Where are we seeing high green cover? And also supply chain data. So crop yield per hectare. You can also customize this if you have this kind of data available to you. So that's like the kind of breadth of different data layers that are available. Once we get into the farm journal data, you'll be able to see like how you may be able to look at their behavioral data in the same way, same sort of heat map. So in this example, let's just like take a look and say, okay, in analyzing this, we're looking for lightly colored counties because those are the highest areas of net emissions factor, right? And there's two real areas that jump out right away. You've got this section in central Minnesota, and then you've got this section in western North Dakota. So let's focus in on this section in western North Dakota because I think there's a pretty interesting story to see here. So you've identified like, okay, we don't need to focus in South Dakota, this northeast section of Minnesota. Let's drill in here. So net emissions factor, and then we're going to look at the GHG emissions factor. So this is basically the net emissions factor without sequestration involved. You see that it's also quite high. So that maps, no surprise there. So we're seeing high emissions from this section of North Dakota. If we look at sequestration, you might think, okay, they're probably not removing a ton of carbon via soil carbon sequestration, but there's some variance there. You actually see some areas where there is high sequestration as well. So starting to tell kind of a mixed story. So just from the emissions perspective, and I'll show kind of a summary slide of all this data as well. But as we get further, we might say, okay, well, what's driving this? Is it potentially practice adoption that's driving this sort of like dissonance? We can look for conservation tillage. And here we actually see very, very high adoption rates of conservation tillage. So almost full adoption in some counties, which is really impressive. So that might be kind of a surprising insight if you're not as familiar with this specific region and this spring wheat crop. If we look at cover cropping, it's actually quite low for cover cropping, or it's sort of mixed as we look at the entire heat map. You can see that there's this area down in like southern South Dakota where there's very high adoption, but basically this is starting to paint like a bit of a mixed story for us on, okay, well, there's high emissions, but we also see pretty solid, in fact, really impressive adoption of no-till and conservation till, but there's almost no cover cropping. So, like, what are the things that are driving that? So, I'm going to go back because I know there's kind of a lot of data and visualizations to throw at you, and I'm just going to show you, a summary slide here. So, like putting this region in the spotlight, um, high emissions, high practice adoption, regen practice adoption, but little rain. And what one layer that I didn't show you there was the climate risk around drought. And we saw significant drought in western North Dakota during 2024, which is where we're pulling this data from. And essentially, that had a major impact on yield. So, yield in western North Dakota compared to eastern North Dakota 1.36 metric tons versus 1.7 metric tons, right? So kind of different data stories that you can pull out. But in summary, like what do we see here? Essentially, there's a yield problem. So factors are measured per kilogram of yield and they're not measured per acre. Because Western North Dakota had this significant drought in 2024, it really suppressed yields. So that denominator shrinks and the emissions factor goes up even with identical inputs. So this ties back to kind of the climate risk signal that Bradley was looking at, and confirms like this may be an area where we want to potentially invest to secure our supply chain. No-till is contributing to high soil carbon sequestration. It's particularly visible in a couple of key counties. There's almost 100% no-till adoption. So you might think like, well, maybe these farmers are behind in terms of like what their practices are. They're actually ahead of the curve in this regard. And then cover cropping, because of the drought, cover crops were not able to actually establish themselves. So there was, underperformance. So there's a lot of detail about this specific supply region, and you can get this very quickly. But how does that actually change how we're going to design programs, right? So you might have the expectation that you're going to do cover cropping, you're going to incentivize no-till, but if you go to folks in this area and suggest that, you're going to lose interest. You don't have like the understanding of the on-the-ground agronomic realities, kind of the history of production in that region. So what producers really might need, we're suggesting, is like a right sizing of nitrogen for a drought year. And that application, that's a very different program design. It also has different co-benefits potentially related to like water outcomes. So in a very short amount of time, you can drill in on your supply chain. What are the different risks? What are the patterns we're seeing over time? And then start to inform that program design. And that's where I would love to hand off to Candace because like we have this concept now of like what's a type of program that we could run, what kind of impact it could have. But how do we translate that from something that might look good on paper or on a heat map into something that is actually economically viable and that makes sense for farmers? And how do you get people to actually enroll in this program as opposed to any others that they might be interested in? So with that, let me hand off to Candace.
Thanks, Jonathan. Wow. Because we're looking up north, that's an UFTA moment for a lot of folks here of, if you walked into that room imagining it, this was a case study that, Jonathan mentioned. We just started pulling some regions that could have interesting data that we've looked at or had interest in before and kind of stumbled upon this little story by creating these different artificial, parameters and things of this company that we had created. But the problems that we found are real. There's little different interesting nuggets that came through of this could happen to anyone. It may have happened to you. So first of all, validating if you've ever walked into this room and had that feeling where the county said like, you're not from here, you're not one of us. We've all been there at one point or another. The really underpinning thing is that with data, you can prevent that moment and in fact come in pretty confident and knowing that and understanding kind of what's going through with a better, stronger shared value story. So with that in mind, kind of stepping forward, want to add a chapter two to our case study. Of course, first phase maybe had a few bumps, a little, need here for some better design. Perhaps they didn't get the full budget they wanted to get to have all the different tools that Jonathan was looking through. Some of them, but maybe not all of them. Pieces of the story were still missing. And then they have layers that they're looking to build forward on. So successful first year, but still continued that slow adoption. They managed to launch and name a program like USA Smart Wheat for that spring wheat focus. But their adoption was mostly referrals from their kind of loyalists within the group, which we see often. Again, that supply volatility hasn't gone away. They're still sweating about that 2024 drought. That was a big scare for a lot of folks. So now the kind of logistics group is really looking at expanding the supply shed or do we reinforce the supply shed? There's trade-offs to be made here. So they're asking from the data, is there opportunity around these borders to expand that out or kind of consider their options? And then, of course, a good old sprinkle of executive pressure, which everyone can relate to. Oh, there's a commitment and announcement that just is a dream and a wish that comes forward. So they're really asking for, does this direct to farmer program that has come in as kind of a dream and a vision from the executive team the right fit? Or for this company, does, Bradley Baker's Co. really stand to benefit a lot from partnering with existing implementers who have some more experience in the field, maybe have some more data at their fingertips, and a little bit more dexterity when it comes to outreach. So there's some opportunities here that we need to walk through. So as Jonathan pointed out, you can kind of layer in the data of what we've learned and kind of move forward. So as we go, since it's Earth Day, we're talking about atmospheric layers. We're now one layer down underneath that cloud cover, looking at what's on the ground with the producer. So we're at eye height of these farmers and ranchers. So at Farm Journal, one of our big things is that acres don't make decisions, the people do. So now we've uncovered these opportunities. What questions do we have to need to ask about this opportunity in Western North Dakota that Regrow has uncovered? And also meet our objectives as a company. So, are these goals even possible? Sometimes a good round number sounds nice, but if there's 200,000 acres of potential cover crop adoption as a goal, to Jonathan's point, a lot of those are already under cover crops or maybe under no-till, or they've done it years ago and then realize it's not a good fit for their soil structure and have chosen something else. There's some history there we need to be aware of. And then secondly, what kinds of operations should be focused on serving? Thinking about that full operation. They're not just spring wheat growers. They might be winter wheat. They might have corn and soybean rotations in a mixture of livestock, especially in North Dakota. There's some beef operations there as well. How do we consider that full package of the person and how these kind of different practices and elements stack up against each other as well? Also, what motivates people? Again, as the person makes that decision, what's going to move the action? Why now versus next year? You've all got things you've got on your list to learn or list to kind of dig into. Producers have the longest list of anyone I've ever met of different aspirations and goals and projects that are half finished. So, how do we make sure that our shared project of doing more conservation sustainability practices and realizing these goals is kind of top of the line? What's going to motivate them to take that action now? And then obstacles, whether they're immovable, whether they're in your control or out of your control. A lot of barriers seem to pop up as a surprise. So that way we can kind of see what's coming. Again, looking to partners, looking at different data to arrange those. Or if even if we're just looking at alleviation, there can be a lot of mitigation strategies as well. But At the end of the day, what did the data tell us about the program, like the farmer on the other end of that program invitation? So I'll show you an example, kind of what we're doing on the next slide. So to pull a study together, again, I created a kind of a mock option of our different producers hitting a different acreage threshold that could be large enough to supply, our Bradley Baking Company, supply demands, meet them in the right area, be located close enough to a mill distribution, kind of doing 100-mile radiuses around different mock locations. And kind of built this audience. So, as I've gotten the corner of this, don't take this to mean this is real data about North Dakota. This is just North Dakota data that we've pulled as a subsample. So definitely take it with a grain of salt. This is meant to illustrate how it can work in a practical way, much more beneficial than kind of thinking like in theory, we could do these things. We wanted to show you that we can and we do. So essentially we narrowed in on our eligible producers. That was step one. Second thing we'd recommend is kind of removing the different folks who've been contacted already. So if you go back one, Jonathan, there's also the measure of assessing the volume of acres and producers. Again, right sizing that to goal, making sure that you actually have the capacity there to grow and to hit goals. So as Jonathan already pointed out, when we're looking at diversification of crops, we can actually see that in this data I've pulled here. So you can see that 100% of wheat growers have been selected, but that other crop mix is there. What other configurations and considerations do we need to accommodate for that 30% that are producing sorghum as well, for instance? So you can see average operation sizes, where that concentration is, where the most producers are, and then also kind of what size they are. How do we accommodate operations that operate very differently than others? So you can see based on this data, very mid to large farm, mid-sized farm, basically is your middle of the road for our selected producers. Again, very strong in crops, but you can see 100% also had livestock. So we're talking to folks who are integrated, diversified operations. So being too just wheat focused would be kind of a missed opportunity here. And also looking at the size of those herds, like we can get really granular into the information. And right away, we have the answer to our email to that executive kind of producement or procurement team of there's a lot of strong opportunity in the area. We're already focused in on our supply shed, but if we do need to expand, the forecast is looking pretty good in Kansas and Nebraska. They're lighting up green for us as well. So maybe leave aside Wisconsin and Michigan for other kind of crop sourcing, but for our spring wheat, Nebraska and Kansas are coming through with good concentration. So we could answer that just that quickly. It took me about 15 minutes to pull this from our kind of data dashboard as well. If you want to go to the next page, basically now we know kind of where. So we've, from the work done with Regrow, we've kind of gotten the weather forecast. Now we've kind of locked in, okay, this is our route. What do we need? What do they need most from us as the kind of program implementer? I'm really putting your hat on as we kind of walk through this. So if you step forward, this is going to kind of get a little sophisticated, a little detailed, and I'm oversimplifying here just to make sure nobody has to spend too much time indoors on Earth Day, as Jonathan pointed out. But basically, we have a tool called the Readiness Index. At Farm Journal, we've actually created this index in a way to assess the readiness of each individual producer to take on a new conservation practice, sustainability practice, or enroll in a program. So that can takes into consideration a myriad of different factors. We kind of have a recipe for what makes a ready producer, and then we verified that with our own program enrollment and our own interactions with these producers and following up after years to see if actual practices have taken place. But essentially, we can see where their mindset at the personal level is. So we know from the regrow kind of work that the soil is ripe for further work in a specific type of opportunity around that nitrogen area. But are the producers ready? What have they been going through in the last several years, maybe even decades, that have affected that experience? So on the left, if I pull just kind of a wide view, you can see like the average readiness score was coming in about 52. So that's not great. It's not terrible either. So that's telling me I have a little bit of a steep grade to kind of get some readiness and adoption in place. So again, if you've done readiness in advance, We could have warned Bradley Baker's company that their adoption would be a little slow if they didn't heavily invest in some different kind of opportunities, resources, and some sentiment change work. But instead, they tried it and then found out that it was a little bit slow. However, if that's your reality, which for a lot of regions it is, you can also just narrow in on those who are already closer in the funnel. So for us, that's like we could slice this at like the top 30% of producers who are ready to engage, who are most likely to take on a conservation practice or a program. That helps us be really efficient because we can kind of not bother those who are not aligned with kind of conservation sustainability practice overall, don't have the financial reality to kind of take those steps this year, remove those who've just done kind of a big investment and they need some time to settle in and kind of get their footing before trying on something else. It really helps us be like most efficient in who we're reaching out to, and then also refine and tighten that message so we know where they are in the process. They've been shopping for kind of options and resources, and we're bringing them exactly what you're looking for. So if you've been, thinking you need a coffee all day, thinking you need a coffee, and someone drops it by, you're welcoming that with open arms. You're very excited, and boy, is it great if it's just your order. That's really a kind of experience of connecting programs that are best fit with ready producers. The others, again, you're not going to be mad if you get a coffee that's not quite your order, or maybe just, you maybe are over caffeinated. You might not want another one, but you might decline as well. So it's just kind of interesting to think about how that interaction as people is going to take place. So that's our readiness index. And then also, we did see some data anomalies similar to what Regrow was seeing kind of at the sky view popping up here as well, where there's a concentration of producers in the top 30% in that Western North Dakota, lighting up very green here for us. So it's really good to see a lot of readiness from the producer mindset represented there. That's both reflective of their history of adopting practices, as Regrow could see, but also that there's been positive momentum. They're not backsliding in this region, which could always be an opportunity. And again, just to double down on that email that you can send, you can see there's another similar pocket in kind of Kansas, Nebraska area that we could take advantage of as a company if we wanted to kind of deploy redundancy opportunities. So moving forward, just to break that down a little bit, especially if you're in the communications, marketing, and outreach kind of responsibilities, and if you're in the program design, naming, messaging, this is really crucial data. And we've seen this really make the difference with a lot of different programs that are going out right now. Taking that plan from in our office at the boardroom where it's feeling really good and optimistic to the field takes some realities. So just to break it down, over here on the right-hand side is actually a radar chart that we build based on that readiness index. But it gives a score for each individual producer or a net of target producers. So essentially in this case, I mapped our kind of ideal region, focusing on that Western North Dakota just for this, and wanted to see where their score was shaking out based on our kind of model that takes place for readiness. So as you can see, I've circled value and understanding. You can see over the far right, they're ready to take action. So all of the attributes that go into that score are, interested in looking at practices. I feel like I have the financial resources I need to do a practice. I feel like I have the labor I need to do a practice. Those both play into both a take action mentality and feeling capable. That capability score there at the bottom is really practical information of, do I have time? I could have all the aspirations in the world to take on a new hobby, but do I actually have the time to attend a seminar, get the tools, and then actually fulfill that practice? Is really how we're looking at that. And then the two here that are pulling down the store, like this is really where we're looking for what's holding you back in your adoption. So value at the top is really about perceived value. So perceived value of the practice to the operation to the operator. So that one we see often quite low. This is actually a strong score. So this tells me that in Western North Dakota, among these wheat growers that we pulled, they've had some outreach. They've felt supported. There's some tools there. There's been investment kind of in their support in that area to have a score quite that high. However, it should be a little higher to get full-scale adoption that Bradley Baker's Co. is really looking for. So to provide some examples of just real practical options if you're faced with kind of a lack of perceived value when you're going to market with a tool like this, is to pair those target practices or programs with ones that are already in use or already have interest in. So a good example is like finding a finance partner who's interested in the shared outcome, especially nitrogen or perhaps water impacts. Are there ways to cost share or provide incentives to these producers in a different way or at a higher tier than you are able to offer now to kind of sweeten that deal, make that step a little lower? That's a key way to kind of immediately remedy a value challenge. Additional one is to offer access to technology. If we've profiled them as interested in technology, that's not a given. Not everyone's really looking for new technology solutions. It does vary and varies quite a lot, actually. But if they're interested in trying new technologies and you're wanting to collect data, could you provide it? Could you give them access to a software? Could you give them access to hardware that could help them kind of learn, explore, get their hands on something, and then also add value back into your program for data collection? One less form you have to fill out if we've synchronized our technology has been a testimonial we've heard that's going pretty well. But just again, these options all really center what the producer needs and then adds that shared goal on top. So really making sure we're not going in the reverse and leading with what you need from them. They're working a full-time job plus, same as everybody else here on this webinar. So leading with what's in it for them, what can you take off their list versus add as a request is going to go a long way. On understanding. Understanding is not understanding of the practice. Most producers at this point do have a very good understanding of what the practice entails, how it would impact their operation, and what it would take to do it. A lot of the education programs have done a lot of that work, and that's complete. So coming back in with a lot of education really doesn't help lift that understanding score. What they really need to know is where, how, and am I eligible? What is there available specifically for North Dakota producers in their specific county with their type of operation that they would be eligible for? That's what they would like understanding in. What does it take to apply, enroll, and be approved to be a part of a program like this? That's what producers are looking for to raise their understanding. And a lot of folks fully understand what everything is available and they're not interested. And that's really key in just understanding what they need. They're going to have a low perceived value, high understanding, low take action, and high capability. So those types of producers look different in our data, and you can proceed differently. And then again, just one of the easy ones is letting people know the technical experts you have. It's a really under awareness kind of piece of value that adds to that proposition would support both scores going forward. So answers like this would be what I would provide back to Bradley Baker's Co. But you can get information like this very explicitly from data you already have or data available through partners like us. So if you step forward, just to kind of get it now that we've kind of established who we're talking to, it's time to get out there. So we know we have an understanding barrier to work through. How do we work through it? So using this data, we can actually bust the myths and capture opportunities on different channels. The very first title slide is really what brought us all together today, which is that there is no US farmers and ranchers prefer XYZ channel. It does not exist. We see a lot of variability across geography, across different types of operations, and especially when it comes to the topic. Think about your own engagement for a second. Do you want to engage with, financial planning information when you're just doom scrolling at the end of the day and looking for kind of entertainment? Not so much. On a Sunday afternoon or a Sunday morning, when you're kind of going to LinkedIn and you're kind of reading those longer form stories or catching up on news, you might click into a financial kind of opportunity mindset because you're feeling a little bit lighter burdened, a little bit more interested in some of those dreams and aspirations. making some assumptions here, but you can see already some differences in experience. A lot of times I think they forget that farming is a business, and you get kind of sick of learning about farming and the things you ought to be doing. Sometimes they just want entertainment as well, and trust and information and awareness have different channels that are a best fit for that message. So for in this case, I just pulled kind of a graph from our media trust dashboard, which shows you kind of what this group of producers would be most interested in. So when it comes to the information, again, we know from the previous slide that they have a perception of value gap. So we're going to have to address that value from a credible source. When I pulled this data and there was a range of ages, they actually had the highest trust in their local newspapers. So that's a great opportunity for really low cost, kind of getting the word out opportunities to put in specific enrollment information, specific dates. Those kinds of things are great. And then conversations around what that value is, it is worth it. Raising their awareness of specific programs designed for them. Those magazines came through loud and clear as kind of a more trusted asset. And just to kind of note how you can read this visual, my benchmark here is the average farm journal row crop producer. So you can see these Western North Dakota folks are just indexing a little higher than the average on these. And then you might assume that there was kind of a digital aspect to this, but you can see they might be using a lot of digital platforms, but there's some skepticism coming through in North Dakota with those online sources. So they might be comfortable finding out about local events or looking at entertainment content, but they're going back to trusted sources of their good old-fashioned magazines and newspapers for that content. So there's a risk. If you don't have this data, the instinct to go for that social media influencer podcast campaign, which is what a lot of folks have been really kind of pushing, and it's kind of becoming a little saturated, may not land. Or they may be interested and listen, but they're waiting to hear an endorsement from this works in my backyard, my soil type. There's a lot of North Dakotans, and shout out in the chat if you're working there or this feels and sounds like you who know that there's very unique soil structure and soil challenges in that area, especially Red River Valley Basin. It's just chemically true that they're different. So, knowing and asking the producer who they trust for information just helps you kind of balance that and avoid gambling when it comes to your outreach. That's always a good play. So, I'm kind of bringing that home in messaging. And this one's going to take kind of a deep breath, especially on Earth Day. There's a little bit of a difference in opinions and belief when it comes to environment factors. We see this often. And again, I didn't stage any of these data sets. We pulled them from a random sample, but I've seen this before on other projects. Essentially, there is a disconnection that can take place where they are very interested and ready to take on conservation and sustainability practices, but not for the reasons you might think. So in this case, when I pulled these North Dakota producers, and again, to remind you, these are our top 30% most ready producers in Western North Dakota that I'm looking at. They were actually, and that's, the wheat parameters, the acreage minimums, etc. They were actually very low indexing on these environmental factors, especially belief in global warming and climate issues, not engaging in advocacy or, pushing one kind of practice. These aren't your no-till farmers and your cover crop champions. They might be doing the practice, but it's for a business sense. However, my call to you is that doesn't necessarily mean that we can't work together. A lot of folks might see this data and have an instinct to start convincing, right? Like, well, you need to change your belief, get on board with us. There's a different way of doing things. There's actually a door number 3 here where we can really bring them together, where you can provide the same resources, the same practices, and have that adoption that we're looking for of shared values of wildlife habitat restoration, water impact, soil performance, all of those things, both for the field and the farmer, especially if you're aware of this in advance, so you know what kind of room you're walking into. So I give the example here of naming a program. If Bradley Baker's Co. had set up a field day and said, okay, we're going to start the Sustainable Wheat Champions. That might give you a cafeteria moment in the room where they might not engage and want to go as deep as you want them to do. Really, the title they chose, which was USA Smart Wheat in our scenario, is going to relate better to these producers where they feel like it's just smart business sense to be doing these practices, and they may or may not agree on that environmental impact element. So going to the next slide, we just wanted to kind of wrap with a couple of different options. This is kind of that key point that Jonathan made around that you're gonna lose the room in 30 seconds. What they need is this nitrogen element. So how can we add the layer to this specific Hettinger County example? If you go to the next slide, I'll show you when we add the layer of this producer information, and these are again screen grabs from kind of our producer dashboard of different data that's available. We could see right there in the middle on that word cloud nitrogen coming through in green. There's medium interest in it. So we see that they're starting to read and research. However, there's a lot of other topics there that are coming through louder, stronger, that we could pair as an opportunity of piquing their interest and sharing that and starting to build that rapport towards nitrogen. We can see, direct engagement and resemblance with other neighboring counties. So if you were to spot where you want to kind of do an in-person activation or demonstration, you can see a cluster of kind of ready counties there in the south. And then also kind of again thinking about your options. Carbon is coming through loud and clear. That's kind of a cool shiny object thing that's being discussed right now. Still, can you capitalize on that versus again trying to convince everyone nitrogen is cool? How can we kind of go where they're already looking and kind of pair that together for a smoother transition? So go ahead into the next slide here. I just love to leave with like kind of a wrap up slide. So this is your screenshotter of some takeaways to apply starting today and tomorrow of, some kind of myths to watch out for, potholes to avoid, spreading things evenly across the supply shed. Every producer is different, very individual. We often struggle to find large trends. A lot of our data starts to look like a weather forecast. You're seeing sunshine just up north and a few counties south, they're getting torrential downpours. So you're going to kind of see that as you're going into field. And boy, is it easier if you kind of know the forecast and can bring a raincoat or an umbrella versus showing up in your winter parka when it's 77 degrees. So that's really kind of how we can use data to kind of better understand the producer as well as see the view from the sky, especially, and the soil when you're working with regrow. So, Jonathan, I'll kind of invite you back to kind of talk through our closing findings.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Candace. And like as a marketer myself, just fascinating to see the type of data that you've put together and how it can have really practical applications. So thanks for walking us through that. Just wanted to cover here before we get to Q&A, a couple of kind of like expectations versus reality and how data might challenge some assumptions. And I'm not assuming that everyone would have these assumptions coming in, but it's possible. So if we looked at expectation, like there's a set of widely accepted regen practices and they can just be deployed broadly. Well, clearly that's not the case. Practice feasibility is very, very local. The appetites are individual, which you see through the farm journal data. And it really just depends very specifically on your supply chain, both from a crop and geo perspective, what's going to work. So you need that level of detail. Maybe you expect farmers in high emission areas always need to be educated on regen practices. Like that's clearly not true. If you look at Western North Dakota, there's high awareness of what's possible, but there's been decisions made that are totally irrational based on the agronomic realities on the ground. You might think good financial incentive and like a clear ask will automatically drive enrollment. Yes, that's going to help. Like money talks, of course, but there are other factors involved, like producer motivation and readiness. And you need to uncover those drivers to be able to like brand your program correctly, use the right outreach channels. It's not just about throwing money at a problem. And then regen ag programs driving towards carbon goals. Like, yes, this is important. And in our case study, like Bradley Bakers was concerned with SBTI flag, but we're also seeing a lot of organizations adopt other frameworks for beyond carbon outcomes. And sometimes the same interventions that reduce carbon, can also reduce input dollars, so that helps for farmers. It can improve yield stability and protect watersheds. So there's a significant, co-benefit angle to this. So only with like the right data set can the folks running these programs really be able to kind of challenge these assumptions and reflect reality. So I know we're going a little long, which is to be expected, and we cut out a good part of this as well. But I did want to get to Q&A quickly because we've got a number that came in. First, I'll take this question from Robbie, and Candace, if you have anything to add, please do. But the question was, how do you think about agronomist relationships as a channel, either to promote projects, practice change, or as challenging them? And first of all, I would say like the every successful program that we've seen has had strong on the ground, like technical implementation partner relationships. That's a defining aspect of the programs where practices actually do scale and where farmers stay enrolled year over year. So our goal is really to arm those folks with the best possible data. But we picked Western North Dakota, but if we would have picked any other crop and geo combination, it would have been a completely different story. And there are folks on the ground who understand those realities already, but maybe just need kind of the data to back them up. So I would say it's super important. But anything else you'd add, Candace?
I completely agree. It's the looks like me, feels like me, gets what I'm going through. Whether you're able to provide that as your organization, you're well established and equipped to do that, great. If you have that on staff, fantastic. If you are able to utilize that through partners, again, that's where the strongest success really can be, is just wherever you source that cool, on the ground, relatable, technical advisor. That's really crucial for these decisions.
Great. I'm going to tie two questions together because I think it's an interesting angle that we didn't really cover here, but they're both around rented and owned land. So one question was, first of all, is Farm Journal pulling from USDA NASS census data, and is rented land accounted for? So that's part one, just technically. And then two, do you see a difference in farmer adoption and readiness with owner operators versus tenant farmers? Really interesting question.
Yes. Yeah, the renting landowner ownership is something we're exploring in a really deep way, in a lot of different ways. We actually just published some like land acquisition transition research in full, so I'd encourage you to take a look at that on AgWeb. It's got some information around landowner management, but essentially, we do use USDA data, but ours is better. They've kind of depreciated their efforts and focus on that for, necessary staff cuts and things like that. So we actually get that collected directly from our producer subscribers and engagements and have that reported. But we do verify and spot use different parts of USDA information that might be valuable or add a layer. We're really about kind of building layer cakes of information. So we do reference that NAS, make sure things are checking out, aligning, and kind of look for anomalies in that way. But really, we have more detailed, up-to-date information. And the main thing we find, especially with the landowner relationship, is a multi-party ownership model. So who's making that decision is who we're looking at. So if it's the landowner who's influencing the adoption of conservation practices, which is true in many cases, they tell us that they're doing that and we look at them and we qualify them in. If that is actually the operator, the renting farmer, who's telling maybe an absentee landowner, hey, I'd like to do farming a little bit differently, then we're looking at them and their responses and their information. So we get better and better at that all the time, but really that's something we're really exploring. And there could be up to 5 different people who are making that decision or kind of having different hats within a family, within cousins, within kind of a, connection as a business. It's really multi-party nowadays.
Really interesting. Thanks, Candace. I have a couple as we head towards the hour that are pretty straightforward that I can cover, which first is, can Regrow expand on the climate risk KPIs? How are those calculated? I would love to follow up with you, Hannah, on with actual documentation on this, because each of them are a bit different. So we have data around drought severity, average temperature, temperature variability, max and min, a bunch of different climate risk layers that you can look at and make like more rich data set, but they all come from different places. And our really like unique piece is mapping them geospatially and overlaying them with the other data layers we have. So I would love to follow up there. Um, what tool was used to calculate emissions on the first case study, the Bradley Bakers? That was a combination of our remote sensing with our DNDC soil model. So DNDC is what's producing the emissions factor. We also do like cradle to farm gate. So it's not just what's happening on the ground, but also all the way to farm gate emissions factors that can be used more easily in inventory reporting. And last one I have here is, are you thinking about GREET 45Z model as a layer? Can follow up with more here, but like short answer is yes. GREET, as I understand it, is a different kind of calculator that's looking at carbon intensity, has different inputs, and then has a different output that can be applied depending on the like 45Z regulation. So if you were the person who asked that question, please reach out because we do have solutions around that and plenty of customer interest there. So I think we got to all the questions in the chat, and we're only 1 minute over. So, really appreciate everyone joining. I know we threw a lot of data at you, and I do just want to like underscore important to have the right partners involved and the importance or the variability from region to region. So, Regrow's happy to support. Farm Journal Trust and Food are happy to support. Please reach out to us with questions around either the kind of like sustainability data that was presented or the behavioral data, how you can tie those two things together. Would love to explore that intersection more with you. So really easy to find us, LinkedIn, website, simple stuff. So really look forward to, and yeah, Candace, any last words before we sign off?
No, I think that's great. Yeah, the chat's filling with like one more question, so feel reach out, use our contact information. Could talk about this all day. I think Jonathan and I were talking about a part two is probably in the future. This raises all boats. Our effort, our vision is your vision. So let's have a conversation, and I hope this was interesting. Thanks for the invitation.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And yeah, happy Earth Day, everybody. Go get outside.